Okay, good afternoon. I'm really very happy to be allowed to be part of this type of events, which are the ELSI Symposium. Is my second time in the 8 years that ELSI functioned. And And to put together this talk, I was inspired by this particular image that could have been, or it is taken from a present day earthly beach. But in the same time, it may look like a day 4 billion years ago on planet Earth. I was asking the question: so what happened? How Earth evolved meantime in such a way that we can have more or less like the same type of scenery, but yet so different. And also, I was inspired by the symposium flyers with these mountains and up and downs, and I was thinking of how our planet worked its way to a state where life is so much more diverse than it used to be when it was generated in the first place. And well, because I am a geoscientist and I'm mostly working with plate tectonics, most of my time, of my talk will be about how plate tectonics function on Earth. And just to answer the philosophical question, what is catalysis? In this context, in my view, is mostly what type of geological processes was the enablers of keeping life or getting life to evolve. So it's something that was enabling or was enhancing what happened in the very beginning. So this is what I'm going to talk about. As I said, mostly plate tectonics, and I would look at how continents split apart, how formed oceans, and then how this ocean disappeared, what ocean means for life in general. Shortly, I would say something about volcanism, and especially about submarine volcanism, and what that may mean for again, keeping the life thriving, and how oceans evolved and allowed life again to continue on Earth. So I will start with this, well, rather busy diagram that shows the first billion years in life, in the life of our planet, starting with when it formed with the core formation, and then the moon formation, and then at some point here we have life ? So again, I guess the audience here knows much better, or trying to figure out when life appeared on planet Earth, and all I can contribute to this is that at least one of the theory is that it was connected to the substrate, and the substrate was a rock. So talking about catalysis, we know that simple minerals are invoked as non-biological catalysis in life's origin. And the rock I'm going to talk about is a serpentine, and we know that the oldest serpentine might be almost 4 billion years, 3.8 billion years ago. It was found in Greenland, in southern Greenland, and is associated with one of the oldest rocks on Earth. And the serpentinite, the rock, looks something like this, is greenish. And the process of serpentinization, we know that it produces hydrogen, and this is an important energy source for chemi-autolytic microorganisms. And these are probably the most primitive organisms. And so the idea is that on a primitive Earth, having ultramafic rocks together with water, we formed this serpentinite, a rock that might be responsible or helped bringing life on our planet. And interestingly enough, because in what I do, serpentinite are connected to different environment on Earth. So I was asking the question, is it possible that the same rock that maybe allowed life to occur on Earth maybe also is connected with the first sign of plate tectonics? And we know that Earth was much hotter, and plate tectonics, if it was present at that time, was completely different as we know it today. So probably it was of much shorter duration than the small oceans, the small slabs that may have been formed, had a very short life, going very shallow into the mantle. And this is a conceptual model here, how plate tectonic might have been at that time. So very small parts of felsic blocks, which could be the first continents, and very short subduction here. And I have asked the question whether the same serpentinite that was one of the first rocks that formed on Earth may have been responsible for starting plate tectonics. And this is because, so as I said today, in today's planet Earth, serpentinite is found on mid-ocean ridge, where basically new plate material is formed. And this happens again because water reacts with the ultramafic material. We have it in transform fault, which are features on oceanic seafloor. We have it in subduction, so it's everywhere basically where a tectonic plate that has an oceanic part attached to it. And on this map, you can see places where these serpentinites have been sampled today. So there are, again, at mid-ocean ridges. They are close to the margins or close to trenches, to subduction zones. And according to numerical modeling, in order to start from scratch subduction, to initiate subduction, and to initiate this type of one-side subduction that we know is present today on Earth, the localization of the formation needs a hydrated shear zone. So, and this is usually connected to serpentinite. So this is more like a philosophical question. Can we connect the very first signs of life that was connected to serpentinite? So this is the chemical formula of serpentinite. Can we connect it from the very beginning with plate tectonics, or the very simple plate tectonics that existed probably 4 billion years ago? So now jumping from the very dawn of planet Earth to how continents are formed and oceans are formed, and talking about fluctuations in Earth processes, the so-called Wilson cycle probably is one of it. And this is how plate tectonics regenerate itself every, let's say, 400 million years. And the simple idea is that we have this continent that eventually was formed on Earth. And then this, because some forces are acted upon it, either horizontal or vertical, the continent is broken, is split. It formed mid-ocean ridges. It formed oceanic lithosphere. Then, for some point, subduction starts, and the whole oceanic plate is subducted, and then collision, and the whole thing starts again. So this is how this or part of these big continents were formed. But if we look at the bathymetry, the present-day bathymetry, we see a lot of small plateaus, submerged plateaus here, for example, in the Southwest Pacific or Southeast Asia. that are not big continents. Some of them are island arc, are formed because of subduction, but some of them have continental origin, which can be much older than the island arcs which are formed here. So these are identified couple of these small continents, we call them microcontinents, and especially in the Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia, the oceanic lithosphere has a lot of them embedded in them. So the question is, how do we form these microcontinents? And there are several. So again, microcontinents are smaller slivers which are shaved from bigger continents. And these are some microcontinents around the world. So I have mentioned this one east of Australia, but then also we have in the Mediterranean, for example, Corsica, we have Baja California in Pacific, and much more. And we are interested in our group to figure out how we shape these bigger continents by subduction. So usually when you have subduction, you start to do an island arc and so on, but not necessarily take a piece of the continent. So this is an example of the Northeast Australia, where we have several of these submerged microcontinents just north and northeast of Coral Sea. And this is a reconstruction about 60 million years ago when all these were part of Australia. And we know that this part of the world was always affected by subduction, whether it was this direction or another direction. So somehow there were some processes that were shaving these microcontinents. And we believe that this is because this subduction, so this subducted oceanic lithosphere, oceans, they either, the slab will break off or it will hit the 660 discontinuity in the Earth mantle. And this is when the break off of the continent occur. So why is this important? Well, this type of process, I think it was quite cyclical, at least for some continents. Continents grew by this process. For example, this again is Australia, is Eastern Australia. More than 1/3 of Australia is formed by these terrains that are either microcontinents or pieces of island arcs that were formed or rifted away from Australia and then brought back. So it was like a tide, a tectonic tide in a way, that managed to increase the size of this continent. But this has also importance for life. And a simple concept in how life evolves is there are two paths. So it's the vicariance. So you have a piece of continent, let's say, where specific life exists, and then the continent breaks. So then these animals are separated, and they evolve then in their own way on that different continental parts. And again, this process can go on and on. So the idea is that every part of this population will have their own evolutionary path. So this is very important to, once you have life, you have to have all sorts of barriers to make it evolve fast and evolve different. So the formation of microcontinents, of shaving these first continents constantly and in some tectonic cycles was very important for adding the life evolution. So some people call this the plate tectonic bump. This has been shown to be very important. So it's one of the four principal ways of how life was evolving in different continental area. And this study, for example, shows with these different colors which parts of the continents, the life on these continents evolved because of plate tectonics. And just look at this magenta color here, showing that most of Europe and most of evolved life on Europe was possible because Europe, it's an amalgamation of many, many bits and pieces of continents which were shaved from the supercontinents, which used to be in the southern hemisphere, and then traveled north. So by taking this life with them up there, so life evolved in this way. So there are other ways, like, for example, orographic barriers or heterogeneities of climate, but a considerable part of life as we know today evolved because of tectonic plate movements. So not only the breakup of continents, but also the collision of continents and microcontinents is important. For example, another study here shows that, again, we have Australia and Southeast Asia, and looked at how the reef population became very diverse. For example, 40 million years ago, starting with only more or less two types of species of reefs here, by the fact that Australia moved northward, so this population was closer to the northern part of population and produced different species. And today you look at a very wide area of diversity of reefs, just because the different population from different small islands that were jumped by the movement of Australia northward got in contact with other type of species, and this produced even more. Going back to microcontinents, it's also interesting to again notice the fact that the biotic and abiotic world got together, and one idea is that continents or pieces of this felsic material that eventually became continents were always in contact with microbial life, and they have helped very much for continents to grow and evolve, and especially in the very early time of the Earth. So after the heavy bombardment, probably that helped to go from this type of plate tectonics, where we have very small pieces of continents or microcontinents, to this type where continents eventually grew, amalgamated, and allowed the plate tectonics as we know to start. This is a movie showing you, so now we go from early Earth to more the last 500 million years. And in green, you see the continents moving around. Then mid-ocean ridges creating oceanic lithosphere and oceanic plates. And several phases of continental breakup and continental amalgamation. So this is how oceans were created and destroyed in the last 400 million years. In colors here, you always see this reddish part as the new oceanic lithosphere being created. As it becomes older, it has these colder colors. So this is what we mostly do in our center in Oslo. And how do we get to have this type of models? Earth magnetic field has been mentioned here, and because of the Earth magnetic field reversals, the basaltic material that forms the oceanic lithosphere gets magnetized in the same direction of the magnetic field at that time. And because the magnetic field reverses through time, so we can record this. So it's like a recorder that tell us how many times and how long it took for the magnetic field to change through time. And because we can record this, we can measure the magnetic field, and we can look at magnetic anomalies that show the remnant magnetization, and helping with a lot more information from today's oceans, we can get to this type of representation of oceanic age through time. And by combining this with information about how continents moved, so we can have these models, tectonic models of the Earth for at least 500 million years. We can go 1 billion years, but not much more back. So oceans or oceanic lithosphere are very important, and they are this conveyor that as they form, so they start recording what happens on the Earth. And I'm going back to this serpentinite story. So as I said, serpentinite was one of the early rocks that formed on Earth, but kept forming. And today we find it in many places, especially in the oceans. And here I'm showing you an image of how fast oceanic lithosphere has been created in present-day oceans. And the blue colors says that it was created rather slow. And as we go to the yellow and red, that was created very fast. So Pacific is very fast, and most of Atlantic and Indian Ocean is slow. So what happens when oceanic lithosphere forms at a slow pace? So it's not enough basaltic material to accommodate the extension. Because of that, it's a lot of faulting. So then the gabbro and the ultramafic material is brought to the surface. And this ultramafic material, again, gets in contact with water, with seawater, and forms serpentinites. Serpentinites, again, is a rock that is weaker, is more porous, it has a higher volume. So from this type of normal oceanic lithosphere, one can get to this type. And here it's a diagram showing of how much serpentinite one forms depending on this oceanic spreading rate. So as the slowest the spreading rate, the more serpentinite one forms, just because this fracture rock is much more able to interact with seawater and form this. And because of that, so the oceanic lithosphere can store a lot of carbon and water. So it starts doing that as it forms, and then as it travels, as it is pushed by the tectonic plates, as it approaches the subduction zone, for example, it carries all this stuff with it. And this is full of carbon and water. So it's a carrier of carbon and water through time. And here, there are these numbers of how much carbon and serpentinite aqua water can have in today's oceans. So if we combine what we know about how the oceans were formed, we know their age, we can look at how this carbon and water has been deposited and carried by oceans through time. And this is what this study did with one of these models looking at oceanic lithosphere for the last 320 million years. And here you see that it's the amount of serpentinite and carbonate varied through time. And this, of course, is because the oceanic lithosphere was not formed in the same pace. So if we go from the present day to 320 million years, you see that the recent times, it was less. We have a peak in the Cretaceous, so about 120, 140 million years. And then it went down, and then we have another peak. So this is the amount of serpentinite that entered trenches, so the place where plates are subducted through time. This is the amount of water, and this is the amount of carbon which is stored in oceanic lithosphere. So just to make the correlation with the spreading rate, here is the spreading rate of the Pacific plate. So it's more or less the amount of carbon that it's stored. Again, it's very much dependent on the spreading rate. And here is the atmospheric carbon dioxide through time. And you see that is not exactly a one-to-one correlation. That's because, so when this carbon gets into the subduction, some of it will go to the atmosphere through volcanism, but there are many other processes that contribute to that. So again, we can quantify through time how much of this important material, which is carbon and water, gets carried by the oceanic lithosphere. And I thought this is interesting to compare with how marine benthic habitat evolved. So this is a study here that looked at how this marine life evolved through time. And here for the last 550 million years. And here is corrected for the availability of food. And you see that the diversity is quite high in the last 200 million years. Then it was a low and the peak and so on. So what they did, they said, and they compare it with the amount of oceanic lithosphere that was created. And it seems that is very much coincides with the timing when the diversity in marine benthic habitat occurred. And this is expressed in this graph here. So what it says is that where you have a blue here, that means that a higher area of oceanic lithosphere was available to marine habitat. So the oceans were kind of larger at this time. And then when the diversity is low, it was a smaller area of this. So it is apparently almost one-to-one correlation between the area or how fast the oceanic are spreading or are formed with how the diversity of marine benthic is able to develop. Here I remind you also the amount of carbon that is stored in the oceanic crust. It seems that is again the same peak in the Mesozoic here coincide with the peak of when more carbon was available, and the same here the peak in the Permian. So I discussed about how the oceanic lithosphere is able to store and carry important rocks which are important for life and the global geochemical cycles. And I talked about carbon and water. But it's not only the oceanic lithosphere which is simply created at the mid-ocean ridge. Much more is happening in the oceanic realm. And here I'm showing you how littered is the oceanic seafloor with volcanoes. Here you see the, the black dots here are off ridge seamounts. So most of the volcanoes in oceans are at mid-ocean ridges, because this is where the whole activity, and this is how oceanic lithosphere is created and accreted. But also intraplate volcanism occurred quite often. And sometimes big plumes that may come from the core mantle boundary also impact the oceanic lithosphere and form large igneous basalts, large igneous provinces. But the idea is that it's an enormous amount of volcanoes in oceans, and their very presence and dynamics influence a lot life, obviously. Here is a diagram showing how many volcanoes are on oceanic lithosphere of particular age, so from 0 million year to 180. And what this tells us is that either the seamount volcanism was much higher in the past, or more volcanoes were added in the same place where older volcanoes were formed. So this has been also observed. So the idea is that we have many more volcanoes now on older oceanic lithosphere, like in the Pacific here, than we have on the younger lithosphere. And here it shows the fact that seamounts and volcanoes in the oceans are formed at mid-ocean ridges, but also intraplate. And there are a variety of mechanisms that lead to that. So why are submarine volcanoes important for life? Well, they are biological hotspots that connect lithosphere, hydrosphere, and biosphere. And counting just the larger seamounts, the ones that are 1 kilometer or more in height, they represent a biome the size of Europe. They are, of course, major passageways for fluid circulation that promote geochemical exchange between seawater and volcanic oceanic crust. And of course, they are habitats for all sorts of type of life. And they are also important for the biota dispersal. So this is important for, again, for life evolution to be able to migrate from one place to another. And the fact that we have these basically stepping stones in oceans is important for life. So again, the same concept of contributing to life evolution and diversification. So if we just take now the amount of or the volume that is produced by submarine volcanism through time, again from 180 million years to the present day. So we see these peaks in the Cretaceous. So in Cretaceous was definitely an interesting time where everything was on steroids. But then it was a decrease and again an increase from 60 million years onward to produce this submarine volcanism. Again, I was curious to know if that has any direct influence of how marine life evolved. And here I found how the marine diatom diversity evolves through time. So for the last 60 million years, the population of diatoms increased. And one idea is that increased because water, the seawater became colder. So a diatom population thrive much more in colder water. But it's definitely is not one-to-one correlation with the carbon cycle. But interestingly enough, it looks like it mimics very well the the history of submarine volcanism formation for the last 60 million years. So it has exactly the same type of peak. And one would ask why that can be, especially the diatom, they evolve in the upper part of the sea column. But this brings me to the fact that seamounts are not only important for geochemical cycles or for being stepping stones in life diversity, but also they are important in ocean circulation. For example, here this is a study showing that a large seamount deflects a lot of ocean currents, and because of that, a lot of it increased the upward transport of nutrients. These are brought into the euphotic zone, and this takes a lot or generates brief pulses of primary production. So maybe this is an explanation of why the population of diatom has the same type of peaks in diversity when submarine volcanism was at its peak. I should wrap up. I wanted to talk about oceanic gateways, but I will go to my concluding remarks. The message that I wanted to bring here is that plate tectonics definitely, although it is a discussion whether life to start needs plate tectonics, I would say maybe not, but definitely for life to evolve and diversify, some processes like plate tectonics seems to be very beneficial. And I gave some examples from planet Earth of how plate tectonics, the formation of microcontinents, the formation of mountains, seamounts in the oceans play a big role in allowing life to go from one place to another, have the nutrients that it needs, and keep going. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. Oh, do you have a question, or you want to? Okay.
Oh, thank you so much for the beautiful talk. I found it interesting, especially the correlation between the diatom and the activity of marine volcano.
Mm-hmm.
So diatom, the shells is actually consist of silica, and I wonder if these volcanic activities actually produce more, for example, silicate or silicon into the marine environment, so that they can actually uptake, which like enables them to flourish. And this actually comes to the second question of these hotspots. So you see more volcanic activities in the old lithosphere, meaning that is this some sort of like a kind of like echoing John's talk, like a hysteresis that we see, that the places where you have more volcanic activity actually allows the new volcanic activities to actually occur much more frequent than other continental.
Yes, thank you. The first question, I suppose so. I'm not a volcanologist, but I know that volcanic eruptions bring a lot of minerals, and they help enhancing the environment very much with a lot of material that is brought by gases and eruptions. As for the second one, indeed, it looks like some recent studies show that there are much more volcanic activity where already the lithosphere kind of was impacted previously with that. So that can be of various reasons. So we know that the big volcanic activity type of hotspot is because there are some quasi-stationary mantle anomalies, and then if you have the tectonic plate moving on it, so then it can produce a lot of volcanism, or they may be some, I don't know, heterogeneous mantle pockets that are carried around. I suppose it's work in progress here.
Say, in order to life to continuously evolve under a similar environment, I think this type of continuity or the feedback process is very important. So I learned new things today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for your feedback.
And I could add to that just a little bit because I've thought about the seamount problem in terms of the deeper circulation. So you have a lot of upwelling from the lower mantle. So the upper mantle underneath this cold oceanic lithosphere is very warm, and it doesn't take much to perturb it to get it to erupt. So that's sort of my pet theory of why there's so much volcanism in that area. So that's very rooted very deep in the planet at the core mantle boundary. Any other questions? Are people really excited to see the posters? All right, it looks like we have people excited to see posters. All right, so I'll go ahead and wrap up this session, and we can thank Carmen once again.